Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Farrington Show. This one's going to be a little bit special. It's just going to be me and an Excel spreadsheet. No Zach as executive producer, no Paul, no Jack, no Andrew. Today we're going to be looking at the NFL draft. I figured the draft's coming up pretty soon. I know a little bit about numbers. I'm super interested in this kind of stuff. And I figured this is a good chance for y'all to see a phenomenon that's known reasonably well in analytical circles, but doesn't get talked about a whole lot in the context of ordinary fans thinking about the draft, namely what's often called the loser's curse. So it's just going to be me and this Excel spreadsheet and some interesting facts. Let's get into it. The loser's curse, you might wonder where this name comes from. Well, in 2013, Chad Massey and Richard Thaley put together a seminal study on the NFL draft called The Loser's Curse. Basically, the argument they make there, we're going to get to look at it a little bit here, is that sometimes in the NFL draft, having an earlier pick is worse than having a late pick. Now, there's two spots in particular that I think this is interesting that we'll talk about. One is right over here at the beginning of the NFL draft, right? So if you look at the side where it's just like 1 through something like 7 or 8, you can see that there's some diminishing returns. So you might wonder what this chart's looking at, right? Well, there's 3 things that are being tracked here. One is what's called WAR value, win above replacements. The second is salary win cost, and the third is surplus value. What's win above replacement value? Well, it's sort of what it sounds like. The thought behind this metric is basically this. At any point in the season, an NFL team can go out and just sign some bum, right? Some guy who doesn't play a whole lot of football, he was good in college, but he's not in the NFL for a minimum salary. There are plenty of players you can get that are like that. We'll call those replacement players. If we build a team out of those players, they'd go something like 3 and 14, 2 and 15, something like that in the NFL. These are players who aren't very good, but can more or less, they can play at a replacement level in the NFL. So we'll call those replacement players. They're the absolute minimum value. The way you measure how good a player is you look at how much they're contributing to winning above a replacement level player at that position. Right? So if Joe Burrow, having him on your team were worth 5 or 6 more wins than having just a typical quarterback that you could get in the free agency market in the middle of the season, a replacement level quarterback, then we'd say he's worth 5 or 6 wins above replacement. Now, it's worth noting, no player usually is worth that much, right? Because there's all sorts of context with teams, there's different positional values, right? So like having an elite quarterback like Patrick Mahomes is worth more than having an elite punter, even if it sometimes hurts me to admit this. So basically what you do is you just take how many wins that player is worth, subtract it from how many wins that replacement player is worth, and you have their wins above replacement value. Make sense? So you take a player's wins above replacement value, which is considering how good they are at their position. The way PFF calculates this, we got this chart courtesy of our friends at the Pro Football Focus. Basically what they do is they rate every single player on every single snap and figure out how good they were, regardless of the immediate outcome of the play. Right? So sometimes lucky plays happen, sometimes unlucky plays happen, and they grade every player. And in short, they do that, give each player a value, look at their positional value, and then you're able to get that player's wins above replacements. So that's what the blue line is measuring here. And you'll notice, just as you'd expect, right back there at pick 1, the earliest players in the draft, on average, are better than later players. Right? So we're making that assumption right here in this chart. Now, the second thing that's being measured here is what's called salary win cost. I got the formula for salary win cost here. Basically, we're going to take 5, multiply it by the 4-year salary of the player at that position on that contract, minus the 4-year minimum salary, divided by the 4-year cap space. So the thought's basically this. The average NFL team spends 100% of their salary cap to get 5 wins above replacement. So we're just going to figure out how many wins above replacement that player is worth for their salary, right? So in order to do that, you have to figure out what their salary costs per win. Take their 4-year salary, subtract the 4-year minimum, divide it by the cap space, and you're able to get what that player's salary is per win they're able to contribute. Okay, so that's a salary win cost. Finally, you ask what's surplus value? Well, as you'll notice, basically every single player in the NFL draft is worth more than their salary. Why is that? Well, rookie contracts, just by their very nature, are underpaid, right? So a player like Lamar Jackson can be making $5 or $6 million a year, if that, on a rookie deal. In fact, on the last year of Lamar Jackson's rookie deal, he was only making $3 million. Seriously. And this is a guy who's producing $30 million or more a year in value most of the time. So he's worth a ton above his salary, right? The thought's basically this: you take whatever their salary is, you compare it to their wins above replacement value, and then you get the player's surplus value, how much more they're worth than what they're being paid. And that's this green line. Now, there's two sorts of phenomena that are worth noticing here. One is that very early on in the draft, you'll notice, as you start from pick 1 and move up to about pick 13, the player's surplus value increases. Why is this? Well, look over here on the right. We've got some of the picks in the NFL draft and what they're worth. Notice that, for instance, right, so like I'm going to be bolding these here. The thought's basically this. The first pick in the NFL draft's making $40 million if they're picked this year, over the 4 years of their contract. That's nearly $10 million a year. But then you go down to pick 11. They're making $20 million a year. Basically half what pick 1's making, right? So you're getting a player that's 9 picks worse for half the price. The thought's basically this. You know, the players at the top of the NFL draft, you frequently get the absolute best prospects, right? We're talking guys like Joe Burrow. We're talking guys like Jared Goff. The players who are really exciting at their position. Myles Garrett. Then you go a little bit further down, right? You go to like 4 or 5, where players are being paid $36, $34 million a year. You're getting guys like Sauce Gardner. You're getting guys like Saquon Barkley. Exciting players, good players, but not worth quite as much. And then you start to get really down in the first round, and players are paid quite a bit less. But we'll talk about that in a second. The thought is basically this. NFL GMs aren't perfect on hitting who's good, right? The fact is players sometimes slip. So Aaron Donald, I believe, went at 9 overall. Maybe it was a little bit later. I guess I can actually look this up. I really should know this, but what are you going to do? Aaron Donald went at number 13 overall, excuse me. Right, so sometimes players like that slip. You know, it doesn't always have to be someone incredible like Aaron Donald, right? You go back to like last year's NFL draft, and all sorts of good players slip down the draft boards. Right, so like even though Trayvon Walker went number 1 overall, at later picks, right, like at 10 you're getting Garrett Wilson, at 11 you're getting Chris Olave, at 20 you're getting Kenny Pickett, right? So later there were interesting players, good players. 13, Jordan Davis. You were able to get strong players later on in the draft. And just because a guy's taken to the top doesn't mean he's going to be the best, right? Like Derek Stingley Jr. went number 3. Still an interesting player, still exciting. But if you could have Garrett Wilson or Chris Olave instead of him right now, you'd take it. So the fact is, going early in the draft doesn't guarantee that the player's going to be the best at their position or the best overall in the draft. So you have to factor that in considering how good they are and what the pick or player is going to be worth. So even though earlier players tend to be better, they're not necessarily better in every case. And if they are, they're not necessarily way better. So as you start to go later down in the NFL draft, right, teams will have players they want. But if you're taking a player at 11 instead of 1, they only have to be half as good in order to justify their salary. And of course, being taken at 11 overall in the NFL draft doesn't mean you're a scrub, right? Many of the players who go there are excellent players. So the fact is, you're not getting a player ordinarily who's only half as good. You're getting a player who's like 90% good. And the fact is, 90% is bigger than 50%. So there's a huge amount of value in those like early mid first round picks. So weirdly enough, actually, having an early pick in the NFL draft, all things considered, isn't always better than having a later one. In fact, in the very early rounds, or very early first round, it can often be better to have a later pick if you're just looking at it with respect to the salary. Now, importantly, you have to. Why do you have to look at it with respect to the salary? Well, the fact is, if you want to get an elite player at a position in the NFL, except maybe quarterback, you just can't. right? You can just pay a really big salary and be willing to give up some draft capital, and you can get an elite player. Davante Adams, one of the absolute best players in the NFL, no question about it. He went to the Raiders for what? A second-round pick? Because they were willing to pay him a bunch of money. They had a ton of money left over and able to sign him to that huge, 5 years, $140 million contract? They were able to sign him for big money because they had this money lying around. Now, why doesn't every team do this? Because the NFL is a salary cap, right? There's only so much cap space that every team has. So while teams and players ordinarily think of like their draft resources, you also have to keep in mind you only have $225 million in salary cap. And you can use that salary cap to get surefire elite players. But when we're talking about the NFL draft, spending half as much money on a player, freeing up that $20 million, gives you the kind of money that lets you bring in somebody like Davante Adams, somebody like Tyreek Hill. At other positions, somebody like Trent Williams. I'm trying to think of other big trades that happened. Even you don't have to trade, right? So in free agency, like the Falcons just got Jesse Bates. Linebacker, teams have been able to get all sorts of good players, right? So the fact is, if you've got the money, you can get it and are willing to give up even nominal draft capital. You can get a player like Khalil Mack on your team, like Von Miller. But in free agency, too, these opportunities come up. So it's really important to consider how much money you're spending on a draft pick in order to consider its value. Okay, so here's a kind of objection you might raise, and I get it. You might think, look, at the very top of the NFL draft, right? Pick 1, pick 2, pick 3. You're able to get these generational prospects, right? Guys like Andrew Luck, guys like Joe Burrow, guys like Trevor Lawrence. And the chance at that, right, the fact that you might be stumbling into that makes the pick more valuable. So I say, okay, I'm not going to fight you on this one. It's totally possible that that's how it works and that sometimes you're going to get something way more important. So instead, I think a more interesting place to look is right at the end of the first round, the beginning of the second. Now this year, because of our friend Zach Blomquist's Miami Dolphins, there's only 31 picks in the NFL draft's first round. But I'm going to be talking like there's 32 just because it makes it convenient. And that's what this chart's considering. So notice, look right where that line for 33 is. It's about a sixth of the way onto the chart. You'll notice, I'm going to zoom in here so you can see it a little bit more clearly. Come on. There we go. There's a huge spike right at 33 in the surplus value of a player. And you'll notice there's a huge decline in salary win cost. Why is that? Well, I've got the salary prices for the first 40 picks in the NFL draft along with their percentage of the previous payment. Right, so like pick 2 is making 95% of what pick 1's making. Pick 20 is making 99.5% of what 19's making. 31 is making 98% of what pick 30's making. But notice right here, pick 32. I've got it bold, underlined, and italicized. There's an enormous drop-off at the end of the first round. Right, we're going from 12.3 million to 9.9 million. That's only 80% at pick 32 of what pick 31's making. Or in other words, the first pick of the second round is only making 80% of what the first pick, or the last pick of the first round's making. And then, of course, it normalizes like immediately. But still, right, these percentages are of the previous. 33 is going to be 80% less than 31. 34 is going to be 80% less than 31. So on and so forth. So you get this strange phenomenon where going from 32 to 33, or 31 to 32 this year, you just can't be expecting that big a difference. Why? Well, you're getting basically the same player on average. Like, look, teams have their targets. I get it. They've got players who are super important to them, they're super excited about, that they've scouted and feel good about. But the fact is, on average, you just can't think there's a big difference between 32 and 33. Right? You're getting functionally the same player on average. Why? Because it's only one difference, right? You're moving from 32 to 33. You might think there's a big drop-off between 1 and 2 because you're getting the best prospect versus the second best prospect. But the difference between the 32nd best prospect and the 33rd best prospect isn't so big. Right? You get diminishing returns here. In the same way no one expects there to be a big gap between 255 and 256. There's not nearly as big a drop-off between 32 and 33 as there is between 1 and 2. So in exchange for this relatively small drop-off in player ability, you're getting a huge difference in salary, right? You're saving $3 million, and this is nice, but you're only paying them 80% as much. So to justify the compensation, the player only needs to be 80% as good. And again, you're getting basically the same player. So there's just not a huge drop-off here in terms of how valuable the player is. Okay, but you might think I'm overselling it here for the following reason. First-round picks in the NFL have a special kind of thing they can get. It's called the fifth-year option. Here's how it works. At the end of the first round of the NFL draft, or for any player in the first round of the NFL draft, at the end of their third year, teams have a chance to pick up what's called a fifth-year option. Basically what it is, it's a fully guaranteed year that adds on some extra time in the player's contract, namely 1 year, and pays them a significant amount of money for that right. So, you like your player at the end of the third year, lots of guys are going to be getting it picked up this year, right? Guys like Joe Burrow, guys like Chase Young, guys like Justin Herbert. Very good players are going to be getting this fifth-year option picked up. Why? It's an extra guaranteed year, a slightly reduced price in the contract, and the fact is, it gives you an extra year. So you might think this is pretty good, right? You're getting this benefit. Maybe that's worth the extra $3 million. Well, I'm not so sure, right? First of all, people way overestimate how often fifth-year options are picked up. I did the math here and gave you some stuff. In short, in typical years, 2020, the 2020 draft class, I'm sort of just projecting, right? They're only going to have maybe 13, 14, 15 fifth-year options picked up. But in typical years, right, you have to take my word for it, not a lot of fifth-year options get picked up, often barely over half, right? So from 2014 to 2019, that's 6 draft classes. In 4 out of the 6 years, only 17 or 18 of them were picked up. That's barely half. 2017 was an especially good year. 23 were picked up. But players get cut. Players underperform. Teams decide the fifth-year option amounts too much for the player. This happens all the time. But this is looking at the entire draft. It gets even worse if you just consider the final years, or the final picks of the draft, right? So for picks 25 to 32, most years only 1 or 2 of them is getting picked up. Again, 2017 is a huge outlier here. Look at 2014, 3 players picked up. 2015, 2. 2016, 1. 2018, 2. 2019, 1. In 2020, I don't think there's going to be a whole lot that are picked up, right? So the only ones that I can see getting picked up, Brandon Ayuk, I think surely will. Jordan Love probably will too. But other than that, like Jordan Brooks, I don't think so. Patrick Queen, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Cesar Ruiz. Like, these aren't guys who are having their fifth year's options picked up. So the fact is, with your pick that's going from 25 to 32, right, these later picks in the first round of the NFL draft, there's barely a 1 in 4 chance that you're going to be using this pick, this fifth-year option. So if you don't use it, it's completely wasted, and you just spent $3 million on a player you probably don't even think is that good. But let's say you do want to pick up the fifth-year option. The problem with that is that the fifth-year option for a really good player is not going to be a whole lot less than the franchise tag, or even a top salary at the field. Right, so I took a look here. We've got the fifth-year option payments of like for each position. Basically, here's how it works. Every single player, no matter what, the fifth-year option is going to be at least the average salary of the 3rd to 25th highest salary. Now, if you play 50% of the snaps or greater over your 3 seasons, then you get to move up a little bit to the 3rd to 20th highest salaries. You make a Pro Bowl on the original ballot. We're talking the transition tender, which is the 1st to 10th highest salaries. And if you make multiple Pro Bowls, then it's the 1st to 5th highest salaries. So you can see here, at some positions like quarterback, you're getting a good deal, right? So like a fifth-year option for Joe Burrow is going to cost $29 million. That's a steal for a quarterback. So you're picking a quarterback there, you think you're going to pick up the fifth-year option. Lamar Jackson, same thing, picked right at 32. This is nice. But then you start to look at some of these other positions. You're getting a wide receiver for like $17 million when the franchise tag's 20 and a top of the market deal's 25. That's not looking so good. You're getting a tight end for $11 million. You're getting a offensive guard for $18 million. Call it 16. Call it 15. None of these numbers look super good, except again maybe edge rusher, right? Defensive edge, getting them at like that 17 to 19 figure is nice, and quarterback. But these aren't the kinds of players who are usually going in these later picks because there's just not a lot of them. So even if you get lucky, right, you take a premium position like defensive end or quarterback or maybe wide receiver or maybe left tackle, you hit with the pick and you decide you want to pick up their fifth-year option. The chances of this of happening are very low, right? We're talking like 1 in 4, 1 in 5, 1 in 6. But even then, you're only saving a few $1 million against the cap, if that. If they were really good and made a Pro Bowl or two, you could just franchise tag them for literally the same amount of money. So this isn't enough to overcome the big difference in surplus value, right? The fact is that pick at 33, that second round pick where you're paying the player significantly less for basically the same prospect on average, is just going to be better. There's no other way around it. The fifth-year option can't make it up because it's probably not getting picked up, and even if it does, I mean, good luck. And let's not forget, right, I'm including picks 25 to 32 here, but 25, I mean, they're making $14 million a year. 33 is making 9.8. I mean, shoot. Sorry, 9.9, excuse me. But that's still like almost, 35% less? There's just a huge difference in price here. And it's not justified by the performance you get on the field. So what's the takeaway from this? People ordinarily think earlier picks are always better, right? Because you're getting the earlier prospect. But when you combine the fact that GMs aren't perfect with the big differences in salary among both the very early picks in the NFL draft, right, 1 to 4 versus what you're getting in that 10 to 15 range, and the hard drop-off from the first round to the second round, it can often make sense to trade down for later picks. You're getting more performance for less price, and in general, excluding players like quarterbacks, right? The top of the draft, if you got to take your quarterback, I get it. But if you're taking something like a cornerback there, if you're taking a running back, if you're taking an interior defensive lineman, God forbid you're taking a tight end or a safety, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense compared to what you can get in the market and where your money's better spent. So I hope this was helpful. I hope this was interesting. I imagine there's going to be some disagreement in the comments. I always welcome that. I'll do my best to respond to you. In any case, thanks to Pro Football Focus for putting together this chart. I really didn't want to have to go through and do the wins above replacement calculations myself. That's a huge pain. Don't forget to like, to comment, to subscribe. Right? Engage with us however you want to, however you can. We're on Instagram. We're on TikTok. We're on your favorite platform. Obviously, we're on YouTube. That's probably where you're watching this. But in any case, hopefully this creates some interesting thoughts for the NFL draft. You can tell whoever you're going to be watching it with that you've got some crazy arguments for the 33rd pick being better than the 32nd. And you see teams fall over themselves trying to trade up for players who might not be at those elite positions. You can sort of chuckle to yourself and think you might know a little bit better. In any case, thanks, y'all.